Senator Moore.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. In April this year, the German Parliamentary Group on Population Development hosted the She Matters conference in Berlin. This conference was actually stimulated by a request from German Chancellor Merkel, who is now who will be the leader of the next G7 summit, that had determined that the key aspect of this conference amongst economic issues will be the empowerment of women. And she hoped that that conference, the G7, would draw attention to the fact that the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls are key prerequisites for their empowerment, as they enable women and girls to lead self-determined, healthy and productive lives. We were very lucky from the Australian Parliamentary Group to have both Dr Sharman Stone from the other place and myself to attend, and we joined parliamentarians from over 50 parliaments who gathered together to enforce the idea that in fact for the G7 and G20 groups the concepts of women's empowerment were important. At the end of this period we actually had what they called an appeal. I've been to conferences before, Mr Acting Deputy President, where we had statements, where we had processes, but in this sense the term was an appeal. And the appeal to the leaders around the world was that we have had enough of gender inequality. Specifically, the group gathered called on the leaders of the G7 and the G20 countries to step up their commitment to sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender equality, women and girls' human rights and their empowerment, eliminate discrimination without distinction of any kind, including discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, ensure full respect for women's bodily autonomy and right to have control over and decide freely and responsibly on matters related to their sexuality, to repeal laws that punish women and girls who have or are accused of having undergone illegal abortion and end any imprisonment for such acts, ensure the respect, promotion and protection of sexual and reproductive health and rights for all, including universal access to quality, comprehensive, youth-friendly, integrated and affordable sexual and reproductive health information, education and services, and together to reaffirm that low and middle-income countries need external resources for sustainable development, and that, in the view of their responsibility, G7 countries and other high-income countries should recommit to the 0.7 share of GDP to overseas development assistance and to ensure debt sustainability, debt restructuring and debt relief where necessary. This appeal, Mr Acting Deputy President, will be presented to the next G7, which will be in June 7 and 8, 2015 in Germany, and hopefully out of that will come an ongoing commitment that will lead not just to the UN conference this September, where the world will gather to ensure that the post-millennium development goal agenda will lead to a new series of international commitments to look at the issues of poverty and empowerment and equity across our globe in the new sustainable development goals. This afternoon, Minister Cash actually presented the report on the recent CSW, where she actually reaffirmed the commitment of Australia to ensure that in their sustainable development goals there will be a standalone agenda on women's issues. This is something that will ensure that the kinds of issues that I've spoken about will be prioritised and there will be an overall commitment to make these things happen, to end gender inequality and ensure there will be progress. When Australia hosted the G20 last year, the government put gender equality in the spotlight, a really strong decision. Assembled leaders endorsed in the Leaders' Communique a commitment to reduce the labour force participation gender gap by 25% by 2025, with a clear goal to bring more than 100 million women into the labour force, significantly increase global growth and reduce poverty and inequality. More recently, the G20 has initiated a Women's 20 with a view to achieving that goal. There is a growing body of research that demonstrates that increasing women's workforce participation drives the economy forward. It is estimated, and I've made this point before here, Mr Acting Deputy President, that this is not just to make us feel good, but we know that by ensuring that women are involved in an equal way in the workforce, we will have great economic gain. gain. We know that in the Asia-Pacific region alone, we lose up to $47 billion a year because of women's limited access to employment. These are from the ESCAP figures, which are based on UN data. The World Economic Forum has also found that across 135 countries, greater gender equality improves national competitiveness. The G20, as we know, has enormous power and reach. It presides over some 65% of the world's population, almost 80% of world trade, 84% of the world economy, and almost 80% of the world's carbon emissions. That's why we need the leaders of the G20 to commit to clear, concrete actions to close the gap on gender equality. And we have to have trust that they're up to that commitment that they've clearly made only this year in Brisbane. We do need more women in the workforce, but we also need to address the specific barriers that hinder women's workforce participation and the very insecure and poor work conditions that many women and men face around the world. A recent report by the UN Women highlights the fact that up to 95% of women's employment is informal. That is, in jobs that are unprotected by labour laws and lack social protection. For example, 83% of domestic workers around the world are women, and half of them are not even entitled to the minimum wage. In Turkey, which is the host of the next G20 summit, women on average earn 75% less than the average man. That is an horrific figure, Mr Acting Deputy President, but when you see that in our own country, with all the advantages we have, the gender pay gap has reached 18.8%, its highest in 20 years. There is widespread appreciation of this fact and also a genuine commitment to ensure that we work to lower this gap with a goal, and I don't believe this goal is timed as yet, but with a goal to ensure that there won't be a gap, that in fact our workplaces, our industries value the quality of work and even the quantity of work. So it doesn't matter about the gender of the person working. The importance is actually the skills available and the skills demonstrated. In that sense, as we've spoken many times, Mr Acting Deputy President, we need as a nation to examine our own performance just as much as we need to work internationally to look at those previous examples that I've given about the situation internationally. Sometimes it is extremely tempting in Australia to think about these issues as another world problem, that somehow they don't belong to us. But indeed, Mr Acting Deputy President, they do. And unless we take action, unless we identify issues that are clear obstacles to workforce participation and also for equal pay in our own country, it seems quite hypocritical to tell people overseas what they should do. For many people around the world, violence and sexual harassment are a daily reality at work or on the way to work. Many women are not allowed to do jobs considered only for men. That gender stereotype and placement of particular work for particular genders continues in our own country as well as internationally. We have to look at the issues around higher pay and status. There has been a particular focus recently at the UN, and also I know it's a particular issue followed up by Minister Cash around the issues of early marriage, where women and girls are forced into early marriage, which actually limits educational opportunities and provides genuine vulnerability in terms of power and independence at home and also in the workplace. Only today, Mr Acting Deputy President, I was talking with some people who are raising awareness of issues in Bangladesh, which is a country where, up until very recently, the Australian aid program had significant investment. Unfortunately, that investment has been stripped only in the last couple of months. But in terms of process, in Bangladesh, it is whereas the statute law for marriage is 18, we know that the practice is very, very strong across the community, that women as young as 14 and 15 go into marriage arrangements simply to escape poverty. People ponder about why people go into forced marriages. Sometimes it is not because they are being forced by family culture, it's because they are poor and the sense of marriage offers some security. What we need to do is that we need to identify what the issues are behind the concerns for marriage, and particularly early marriage, which has now become an international campaign to identify the dangers of young women being forced into marriage at an early age, not only increasing the dangers of the chances of having early pregnancy, where there is an incredibly high mortality rate because of the lack of medical support and also because of just the age of the young women, but also we need to see that it is not a cultural issue. I think, again, Mr Acting Deputy President, there's a presumption that it's culture that forces this situation in countries, and there will be an element of that. It is certainly not distant from culture, but when you have the evidence in front of you that consistently it's because of ongoing fear of poverty and inability to cope, there is the opportunity for the international community to work effectively to identify the causes of the poverty and provide support, which would then open the opportunities for families to provide support to their children, men and women, but to ensure that those opportunities for training, opportunities for education, and then the opportunity to have effective employment will mean that women will have an effective choice rather than force, but choice. Mr Acting Deputy President, it is incredibly important that we see these issues not just as rhetorical statements. We have the opportunity to make real change. But again, it's one thing to sign up to international agreements, when we have done so at the G20 only recently, and I actually acknowledge the work done by the Prime Minister in having that commitment at the G20. It's also important that we go to the CSW for the status of women at the UN and talk about our concerns about what's happening across the world for the empowerment of women. But when we see the current impact of our aid budget, and as I said earlier, the appeal that went out to the G7 and G20 countries from our meeting in April was that we recommit to a goal of a 0.7 share of GDP to overseas development assistance, on the basis that we are a country that has made those commitments, that is actually regarded so strongly, so well in the international community, to now have the situation where our own aid responsibilities are being reduced, where we are removing ourselves from any hope of getting towards a 0.7 contribution of our GDP. In fact, as of this year, our contribution to overseas aid is at the lowest level that it has ever been. And that's something which is difficult for us to understand, and we need to make clear that if we are going to work effectively in the international sphere, which we do, and Australia has had such a history of doing that, there are commitments we need to continue. And certainly when you see the aid programs that have been cut, many of them relate specifically to support for women and girls, which has always been a strong component of our aid commitments, to see programs being cut in Bangladesh, to see programs cut across the African area, to seeing programs cut in the Middle East. Many of these programs were directly related to the empowerment of women and girls, health programs and education. And Mr Acting Deputy President, that is something that we as a parliament and we as a community have to consider, because in September this year, the Australian government, along with many other nations, will gather at the UN and they will make extraordinarily valuable commitments to how we see the future of our globe and how we see how we are going to continue to tackle the horrors of poverty and inequality around the world. Given that, it is so essential that we are able to put an effective plan in place in our own nation to see how we can help and support people across the world to reach the goals they need to attain. 20 years ago, the world leaders in civil society came together in Beijing and agreed to the most progressive roadmap for women's rights the world has ever seen. To quote, and I will continue to quote these words, Mr Acting Deputy President, to quote Hillary Clinton's powerful speech at that conference in 1995, where I was in the audience, she said, "Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights." Unfortunately, as we assess this powerful document 20 years on, Rather than take it forward, we have to fight just to secure the human rights principles we agreed to last century. The Australian government has been a great champion of women's rights at the United Nations and a great supporter of moving this agenda forward internationally, including by elevating gender equality as a pillar of the aid program. We have a way to go. We have the skills, we have the commitment. We just need to ensure that we can continue to focus on those things that are important not just to us here, but internationally. Mr. Acting Deputy President, when the appeal was handed to the representative of the German government in Berlin in April, they had the commitment there from parliamentarians from 50 countries. That was from across the whole world. We were lucky enough to have countries, newly developed democracies such as Afghanistan, send women parliamentarians to that conference. To hear the experience of that young woman who is a member of the Afghani parliament and the dedication and commitment she has to serving her own community, but also accepting that Afghanistan is a nation of the world and will be working towards ensuring that women's equality will be promoted, not just at home, with all the difficulties and barriers that exist in that country, but across the world. When we gather with women from Afghanistan, with women from the African continent, with South American parliamentarians, and we agree that we can do better and we can meet the goals that we have agreed, we have hope. And we have hope that the Sustainable Development Goals agreed in September this year will have the genuine commitment from nations across the world, and we in Australia, as we've done before, will work cooperatively to ensure that we take our part in the development that has to go ahead. I feel we can do that. We will have to make some changes to commitments we've made in the past. But Mr. Acting Deputy President, it does matter. The stats that I've read out this evening indicate there is great need. And if we are going to have the genuine equity that we all hope for, there will have to be movement, and there can be. I would hope that the parliamentary groups and population development across the nations will continue to talk about these issues in their parliaments, talk about these issues in the community, and then act to ensure that our budgets, our policies will make sure that there will be change.
Thank you, Senator Moore.